It is Friday, the 6th of December, and I am engaged in my alternative spiritual practice of protesting against Unitarian Universalist injustices and abuses, to say nothing of hypocrisy and stupidity and so on. And it's a Friday night. It's the 5th day of the Unitarian Universalist observance of what they call Chalica, which is essentially, how can I put it, 7-day holiday or time of observance dedicated to the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. Each day is dedicated to one of the 7 principles, and today, being the 5th day of Chalica, is dedicated to the principle which calls for affirming and promoting the right of conscience. Good day, sir. And use of the democratic process in Unitarian Universalist congregations and society at large. So essentially, in the 5th principle, Unitarian Universalists are claiming to believe that every person should be able to exercise their right of conscience, and that Unitarian Universalists, in any case, basically should practice democracy in their Unitarian Universalist congregations and in society at large. Essentially, Unitarian Universalists at the Unitarian Church of Montreal, to say nothing of elsewhere in the Unitarian Universalist religious community, have actually repeatedly made a total mockery of this 5th principle in their ongoing efforts to minimize my ability to exercise my right of conscience in terms of acting upon what my conscience tells me, in terms of engaging in peaceful public protest against various Unitarian Universalist injustices and abuses, which includes clergy misconduct, a subset of which is clergy sexual misconduct, and a further subset of which is Unitarian Universalist ministers engaging in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. And that is a quote from a legal letter that I was served in June of 2012, courtesy of Stikeman Elliott, Barristers and Solicitors Litigation Lawyer, Maître Marc-André Coulombe, acting on behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation, Association. Hello, hello.
Are you here to protest a memorial service for Polytechnic?
No, I'm protesting Unitarian Universalist problems.
No shame.
Actually, it's you people that have no shame. In fact, you know why I'm here? You know, one of the reasons I'm here is because you try to portray me as a Marc Le Pen type character. You're the people who have no shame, try to pretend that I'm a Marc Le Pen kind of guy. What? No, you're the one. I think your wife needs more help than I do, my friend, with her paranoid fantasies. So that was David Rollert, the wife of Reverend Diane Rollert. And since we're on the subject of Unitarian Universalists misusing and abusing the law to try and suppress my right to engage in peaceful public protest, we will deal with how Reverend Diane Rollert actually was successful in suppressing my right to engage in peaceful public protest for a whole year. When Reverend Diane Rollert became the minister of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, following the departure of Reverend Ray Drennan, I sent Reverend Diane Rollert an email letting her know that it was quite likely that she had been not exactly told the truth about why I'm protesting and so on, and that it would be a good idea for her to engage in dialogue with me towards the end of finding out my side of the story, as it were, to engage in what Unitarian Universalists call a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and as part of a effort to practice justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. So I was essentially asking Reverend Diane Roller to speak with me, to hear, why I was protesting, what it was about, and ways in which this ongoing conflict could be resolved. And she did no such thing. On the contrary, as per what I just said to David Rollert, Reverend Diane Rollert sought a restraining order against me. She claimed to be very frightened of me. She also claimed that I had screamed at her, which I'd done no such thing. In fact, basically, I just shouted at David Rollert louder than I've ever shouted at Reverend Diane Rollert. I shouted because David was a good distance away from me, and I wanted him to hear what I had to say. He was the other side of the street, at least 40, 50 feet away. There's traffic noise, so I shouted. I wanted David to hear what I had to say. And as part of peaceful public protest, it's perfectly normal to shout and yell slogans. One can even have a megaphone if one wants. So getting back to Reverend Diane Rollert, she falsely claimed that I screamed at her in a brief conversation that I had with her following sending her the email. I simply asked her if she had received the email. She indicated that she had, and then she essentially said that she wasn't going to do anything. She wasn't going to engage in dialogue with me, and when I asked why, she responded church policy, or possibly church polity. I didn't, it was, those two words, policy and polity, are very similar, and I'm not quite sure which of the two she said. But essentially she was saying that, the church, as an institution, had decided, that Reverend Diane Rollert was not going to engage in dialogue with me. And she was kowtowing to the church, essentially. So as she walked away from me, I had a couple of more things to say to her, and then so I raised my voice somewhat. And as I said, not nearly as loud as I just shouted at David Rollert, hardly screaming. And David Rollert provoked me by insulting me a few times. So in terms of Reverend Diane Rollert, she hadn't actually insulted me. She had said some things that were a bit silly that got my back up. That basically, she was, kowtowing to the wishes of the church in clear disregard of the 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism. So I was a little annoyed with her, but I didn't scream at her, and I didn't shout as loud as I shouted just now. In fact, this is about the loudest I've ever shouted in this whole protest. So, Reverend Diane Rollert sought this restraining order. She rounded up members of the church to bolster her claim about being very frightened of me. And various members of the church, not a great many, but I can't remember exactly how many, but at least half a dozen, not more than a dozen or so, wrote various depositions to the police. And included in those depositions to the police from Unitarian Universalists, claiming to be very frightened of me, in order to try and obtain this restraining order to suppress my ability to protest in front of the church. One fellow whose name is eluding me at the moment, I'm trying to remember his name, it's a bit unusual. Anyway, his name doesn't matter right now. I do know it. It's just not quite getting dredged up from the memory banks. But this particular, Sean Doring. Sean Doring, that's the name of the fellow. And in his deposition, he claimed, that he was very afraid that I was going to come into the church and shoot people. And he described this as an imminent threat. So this is back in around 2007, 2008. This Unitarian, Montreal Unitarian, is claiming, you know, that he's very, very afraid that I'm going to come into the church and shoot people up in a manner similar to what Marc Lepine did at the École Polytechnique. So in fact, one of the reasons I'm here tonight is to let it be known that I'm not very happy about that characterization of me. It's a deep, deep insult to be compared to someone like Marc Lepine. I've never seriously contemplated any kind of serious physical violence against any member of the Unitarian Church of Montreal. I don't own any weapons, I don't own guns, etc. I'm really not interested in such things. I've never, in the whole course of this protest, ever caused the slightest physical harm to any member of the Unitarian Universalist Church. Not even a scratch or a bruise, to the best of my knowledge. And in fact, Montreal Unitarians, a few of them, not that many, but a certain number of Montreal Unitarians have actually assaulted me or made serious threats against me. One such threat was a member of the church, Jim Wilson, who saw me one Sunday protesting as I normally do on a Sunday. And he said, come back here next week and I'll punch your fucking lights out. So basically, I decided that that threat was serious enough to at least report to the police and see what they thought about it. So I called up 911 and reported what I considered to be a comparatively minor threat about somebody who was definitely threatening to punch me. And as can be understood from what he said, when he says punch your fucking lights out, it does mean punching me into a state of unconsciousness. So I reported exactly what he said to the 911 dispatcher, and she said, oh, death threats. I said, well, no, not really. He just threatened to punch my fucking lights out. And to this response, where I played down the seriousness of the threat, the 911 dispatcher pointed out to me, well, when somebody is punched into a state of unconsciousness, they don't always come out of a state of unconsciousness. In other words, they die. And so we consider such threats to be death threats, and that they're treated as such. So in any case, to make a longer story short, Jim Wilson was subjected to non-judicial treatment for his threats against me, and he had to promise to keep the peace for a full year. I actually could have had a restraining order against him. The Crown prosecutor who was handling the case, when she spoke with me and told me what was happening in terms of him being subjected to non-judicial treatment, she said, that if I wanted to, I could have a restraining order against him that would prevent him from coming anywhere near me. But I felt that the threat was sufficiently neutralized, and so I kindly waived that right. In other words, I did not prevent Jim from coming to church, because it would have been hard for him to come to the Unitarian Church of Montreal if I had a restraining order against him that was good for, so many hundreds or thousands of feet in a circle around me. So, yeah, I thought it was quite unfair, as it were, for Reverend Diane Roller to sometime later seek a restraining order against me on what I consider to be paranoid fantasies or pejorious lies or a combination of both. In other words, it is possible that Reverend Diane Rollard actually was very frightened of me, but she had no real reasons to be very frightened of me. So in that sense, she was essentially deeply insecure to the point of possible outright paranoid fantasies. If she was not very frightened of me, as she claimed, well, then she was lying. In which case, she perjured herself in a court of law in an effort to obtain this restraining order. that actually prevented me from protesting for 1 full year. So again, that's one of the reasons why I decided to come tonight. I wasn't actually planning on it. This is somewhat impromptu. And the main reason for coming tonight was simply because it's the 5th day of Chalica. And that day is dedicated to right of conscience and use of the democratic process in society at large, to say nothing of Unitarian Universalist churches. So I'm of course protesting the fact that Unitarian Universalists have gone to extreme lengths to suppress my ability to exercise my right of conscience, to suppress my ability to engage in peaceful public protest, which is basically the last resort of the democratic process. Once the democratic process, for whatever reason, has failed to responsibly address a particular problem, about the only democratic thing left is to engage in peaceful public protest. So as it happened, though, I did look at the church newsletter to see if anything of any particular interest was happening tonight. And besides the fact that it was the first Friday social, which is basically a social supper gathering that Unitarian Universalists have on the first Friday of every month, I did notice that at around 7:30 tonight, there is some kind of service dedicated to the women who were killed by Marc Le Pen at the École Polytechnique on the 6th of December, some years ago now. And when I saw that, I did have some second thoughts about whether I should come. It is a touchy subject. And of course, we can see from David Roller's attitude, that it's sacrilegious to protest, on a night of such a nature. Well, the fact of the matter is, as I said, basically, if not Reverend Diane Roller herself, certainly Sean Doring tried to portray me as a Marc Le Pen type character. Sean Le Pen, sorry, little Freudian slip there perhaps. Sean Doring, actually wrote in a deposition to the police that he was afraid that I was going to come into the church and shoot people up. And in his letter, he described this as an imminent threat. We're talking again 2007, 2008, 5 years ago or more. So obviously, Sean Doring was rather mistaken. And again, the question arises, was Sean Doring just, living in a little fantasy world where he just dreamed up this fantasy, that I was going to come in and shoot people up in the church? Did he really believe that? Or was he just bullshitting, just to, add to the, hope that they would be able to get a restraining order that would prevent me from protesting? And I should add that this restraining order that the Unitarian Church of Montreal sought, essentially in their minds, they felt that if they obtained the restraining order, that it would be continual, extendable beyond the initial 1 year period. It is very, very clear from what Reverend Diane Roller herself said to me when I returned after it was over, and what various other leading members of the Unitarian Church of Montreal said to me, that in their minds, and perhaps based on legal advice that they had obtained, they thought that I would not be able to return after the restraining order was over and continue my protest. There are some possible grounds where that could be possible, but it would only be possible if I was repeating the behavior that the restraining order was for. And of course, the restraining order was for alleged threats against Reverend Diane Roller. That was pretty well it. It was based on Reverend Diane Roller alleging that I had made threats against her and that she was very, very frightened of me. I should add that the so-called threats that Reverend Diane Rollert claimed that I made against her were in the email that I sent her. In other words, they're in written form. Anyone can go and read the so-called threat on the internet, because I actually posted the full text of that email to the internet very soon after I sent it to Reverend Diane Rollert. In other words, even before she, went for this restraining order to suppress my right to engage in peaceful public protest. What she construed as threats against her was a little warning that I put in the email saying that there were actions that I could have taken earlier, i.e. before she even arrived, that I'd held in reserve. Once I became aware that Reverend Ray Drennan was retiring, as he put it, and leaving the Unitarian Church of Montreal, there were certain protest actions that I had felt, could be useful at some point. But as I said, when it became clear that he was leaving and a new person was coming in, I decided that I would not exercise those particular protest actions. I would hold them in reserve, and perhaps use them if the new minister didn't really want to settle the dispute. The interesting thing is that these protest actions, for the most part, haven't actually been used. In other words, I still have them in reserve. I haven't actually exercised them. I've been quite happy to sort of do my usual protest activities. But these actions are basically either 100% legal or no more illegal than the ersatz civil disobedience that Unitarian Universalist ministers regularly engage in to deliberately get themselves arrested for the publicity value that they reap from getting arrested protesting against something. So, as I said, there's nothing in those protest actions that is any different than what Unitarian Universalist ministers quite regularly do. And in fact, my own preference is not to deliberately try and get arrested. I think this whole fake civil disobedience bullshit is exactly that, just bullshit. I have very little respect for people who deliberately break minor laws just to get arrested so that they can say that they were arrested protesting against whatever cause. The things that they get arrested for usually have absolutely nothing to do with the cause that they are protesting against. Typically, Unitarian Universalist ministers will block the entrance to a building to get themselves arrested for trespassing. Again, they're not really getting arrested in real civil disobedience, which is deliberately breaking a law that you believe to be unjust. So anyway, here I am. It's the 5th day of Chalica, and I am protesting against the fact that Montreal Unitarians and the Unitarian Universalist Association have done things that are basically make a total mockery of the fifth principle. They have done things from the very beginning of this conflict that attempt to prevent me from exercising my right of conscience. They have misused and abused the democratic process within the Unitarian Church. Specifically, the Unitarian Church of Montreal is definitely guilty of changing their own bylaws to change the rules in the middle of the game, as it were. I guess I do have time to go into detail on that. I have about 5 minutes left. When I was distributing letters to church members airing my grievances, this is back in let's see now, I guess 2006, early to mid 2006, you know, when it became clear that Reverend Ray Drennan was refusing to apologize for his anti-religious intolerance and bigotry, etc. And when it was clear that his verbally and psychologically abusive clergy misconduct had been condoned by both the Unitarian Universalist Association and the board of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, I began to distribute letters of grievance to individual members of the congregation. I was exercising my right of conscience, and I was trying to use the democratic process within the congregation. I was trying to persuade a majority of church members that there was a serious problem that needed to be addressed, so that they could basically tell the board, no, you have to deal with this. You know, you have to see to it that Reverend Drennan retracts the offending statements and apologizes and so on. So all I was doing was distributing letters. Well, the board found an existing UUA policy called a disruptive behavior policy. And this policy is basically intended for people who are seriously disrupting church services. And they try to pretend that my calm and peaceful distribution of letters of grievance was disruptive behavior. So they, again, to make a somewhat longer story short, when Reverend Ray Drennan finally, under some duress, offered what he called an apology, and which was basically a non-apology apology that was completely unacceptable, and I rejected it and made it clear that I expected a better apology that clearly acknowledged wrongdoing, that clearly retracted his offending words. I put a letter in the mailbox of the board members, and this was used as a pretext to kick me out of the church, although not immediately. The church waited. Let's see now. Yes, it was several months. It was only when I again distributed letters to the congregation, but this time outside the church as people were leaving, which was actually in accordance with the agreement that I made with the Disruptive Behavior Committee. So I was not in any way violating the Disruptive Behavior Committee's guidelines, if you want to use that term, which I think were very anti-democratic anyway. But I complied. Nonetheless, I was kicked out for 6 months. Now, looks like we may not, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I'll try and get through this quickly. So I was kicked out for 6 months. I stayed away for 6 months. And when the 6 months was over, I came back. Now, the disruptive behavior policy basically said that on a first offense, the person's kicked out for 6 months. If there's a second offense, then at that point, they will hold a congregational meeting to vote to terminate the membership of the person who's supposedly violating the disruptive behavior policy, and that they would require a 66% vote, a clear majority, to kick the person out of the church completely. I wanted that to happen because I was confident that in such a meeting I would actually be vindicated. Well, yeah, it looks like we're not going to quite make it here, but essentially I began my protest in May of 1998 in part to provoke the church into having that meeting. They knew they didn't have the votes, so instead of having that meeting, they just extended my suspension for a full year, even though that was completely out of alignment with their own bylaw. So yeah, looks like we managed to get that into the 30-minute span. So yes, they basically changed